Wonderful. Okay, I'm hoping that the big wide world out there can see us moving and talking and speaking right now, because I'm really excited to be hosting an expert panel on writing for games. We're just going to do some quick introductions. My name's Hannah Nicklin. I am a writer, narrative designer, and now studio lead at a Danish indie game studio called Die Gute Fabrik. You might know us most recently for Mutazione, which won a bunch of IGF awards and some awards for story and stuff. So hopefully that's some evidence that I know what I'm talking about. And the reason that I brought this panel together in particular is because on the 24th of May, so very shortly, subtract today's date, which I actually don't have in my head right now, from 24, and you'll have the number of days until my book is released. That book is called Writing for Games and is about the theory and practice specifically of writing for games, not narrative design, not environmental storytelling, the craft particular to using words within games, which I hope is going to be a really useful resource for a bunch of people in a bunch of different disciplines. And what better way to celebrate the release of a book about writing for games, I thought, than to bring together some of my favorite writers and thinkers about writing in games. So that's why we have here Jake, Matthew, and Chella, who are going to introduce themselves just now, because there is nothing worse than hearing your biog read out loud to you, in my experience. So I'm going to hand you over to Jake first, who's just going to tell you a little bit about himself.
Hi, I'm Jake Elliott. I work with Cardboard Computer, which is like a really tiny studio. There's just 3 of us, and we've just made one kind of game that we've shared publicly so far, which is called Kentucky Route Zero. And I was the writer, and since we're such a small team, I'm also like a programmer and designer on the project.
Thank you so much. And let's throw to Matthew.
My name's Matthew Seiji Burns, and I've been in the game industry for a while now in a lot of different roles in AAA and indie, and as a producer and a writer. Most recently, I work with a small studio called Zachtronics. We made a visual novel called Eliza, which I was very proud of. And I'm also somewhat known for this Twine game I wrote with my friend Tom Bissell called The Writer Will Do Something, which is about being a writer on a AAA game.
Yeah, which is actually genuinely referenced in my book. It's a footnote. It's in there. And Chella, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Chella Ramanan. I'm the co-founder of a micro studio. There's just 2 of us called Threefold Games, and our debut game is called Before I Forget, which is a narrative exploration game about a woman with dementia, and was nominated for BAFTA in Game Beyond Entertainment. I'm also I was the writer and narrative designer on that. I'm also the creative lead on Windrush Tales, which is a game that's in pre-production at the moment. And I am the co-founder of Puck in Play, an organization founded to improve the visibility and representation of people of color in games and the games industry. And I also work as a narrative designer and writer in the AAA space as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel like those bios got progressively longer, so I imagine that everyone along that line is progressively tireder. I don't know. That sounds like a lot, Chella.
Sorry.
So just a final reiteration before we get into the questions that I'm sort of going to ask the members of the panel to think through with everyone. This is about writing, and I think one of the really exciting things about LudoNarraCon is that it allows us to dig deep into the craft of story in games, because it's a really specific conference and event already. It allows us to think deeper and particularly about writing, because, as you know, hopefully you're an audience of people who love story and therefore understand that words mean things. So narrative design is the craft of using game design to communicate story. But I would describe game writing as specifically, again, about the words that we use, the character arcs we draw, dialogue, that kind of thing. And it's just such a pleasure to be able to bring together some wonderful people to dig into that stuff. So let's get started, trying not to clap too loud because I am excited. And we're going to start with my first question for everyone, which is around writing at different scales of games. Because one of the things I think that you have to acknowledge as soon as you get into the craft of writing for games is that material conditions affect the material that you get to create. So the size of the scale of the company that you're working in, down to the tools that you're using, or the way it's displayed on screen, all of these things shape the kind of writing that you can work with. And as Matthew sort of teed us up, we're going to go to Matthew first, because I think the writer will fix it is a really interesting little thing about precisely that, the material of writing for games. So do you want to kick us off there?
Sure. Yeah. I think the conditions, like you said, that writing is created in definitely affect the final product. And in AAA versus indie, at least in my experience, AAA just has such larger teams and with so many constraints on the writing or things that the writing is trying to do all at once. The writing needs to convey story information. The design, designers will say, well, it needs to, the players need to know where to go and what to do. Other people will say, well, the characters need to be likable, and we also need to convey this lore or whatever. And so suddenly you have room for just one sentence or a couple sentences, and you're actually trying to do several different things with that one sentence. And there's so many different stakeholders and also just opinions within the studio on what good writing is. It often gets kind of watered down in a way because someone comes in and says, this isn't good writing, we have to change it. And indie, in my experience, can have a little bit more freedom to explore things that wouldn't necessarily fly in a AAA environment,
For sure.
I think that's in a nutshell, like my feelings about that.
And The Writer Will Fix It is a twine game, which is essentially about the Sisyphean task of being a writer in a AAA space, which is slightly dysfunctional, right?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, and it's about kind of saying one of the central things in that story is, are we writing something that's funny and light and very much a game, or are we kind of telling a serious story? And there's a tension between the kinds of things that you do in the game, especially in a AAA game. You can imagine the gameplay of that game actually being kind of silly if you think about it in terms of this, but this is supposed to be a serious story, right? That the famous ludonarrative dissonance of a game like Uncharted or something like that, where he's supposed to be this pretty decent guy, but then throughout the course of the game he's actually literally killing dozens and dozens of people, right? You couldn't really do that in another medium. So there's this weird tension there between those things, and then solving that with trying to just paper over that and say, well, we'll solve that with just writing, or we'll solve that with a story over on top of the game is there can be a lot of tension in that approach.
Yeah, I think what that brings out really nicely is the fact that one of the qualities of the material of writing for games is that writing is cheap, right? Mm-hmm. I can go in and change a line, right? If you take out localization processes and VO, I can go in and change a line if the art turns out different and you're referring to red hair when you meant brown hair. You can go in and change that. And that's one of the really exciting things about the material of writing for games, except that one of the challenges is writing is cheap. So people will often look to you to solve their problems and set you problems which are largely unsolvable. Chella, you've fairly recently, I guess in my head, but there was a pandemic which changed my perception of time. So maybe not that recently moved from indie to AAA. But I wonder if you could talk about some of your perspectives of being a more recent sort of switch from that one end to the other of scale.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I noticed, the first thing I noticed was how similar it is in terms of the emotional arc of making a game is the same no matter what size it is. You know, you have that heady sort of honeymoon period where everything's amazing and this is the best thing that's ever gonna hit players in the universe ever. And then you have the sort of, you know, the period where you're sort of grafting, and then you get to the sort of nadir of making a game where you're just like, this is all nonsense. What was I doing? The folly of this whole thing. And it kind of struck me that whole sort of emotional arc is the same no matter what, no matter how much money you have or how many teams there are, or, you know, like how many animators, or you know, how lavish your cinematics are. And then the other thing that struck me is how much paper design you do without a sheet of paper. So like as an indie dev, I used to write. I wrote all the script for Before I Forget longhand. I like writing longhand and just having that tactility. And I use fountain pen and have notebooks, and just like solving a lot of our problems just on a roll of cheap wallpaper, and sort of just having like paper to move around, and just and then I was just really surprised that we call it paper design in a big studio setting, and there's not even a room with lots of paper. You know, there's not. I thought we'd have a more sort of playful approach to sort of writing, and but there isn't. So I've kind of had to learn to write quickly, because deadlines are, you know, like fixed, because, you know, you have to record the lines, or, you know, they've booked the actors and the studio and things like that. And you know, sometimes they come out, you know, the deadlines can come all of a sudden for whatever reasons. Pandemic doesn't help, that sort of thing. And so I used to write longhand, and then the deadlines were just so like back to back that I, you know, just write straight into the editor now. And so that's interesting how that's changed my process essentially.
I think one of, sorry.
It was just I thought of that fairly recently actually. I was just like, oh, I don't really write in my notebooks that much anymore. I just do it straight because there's just no time.
Yeah. I have a lot of really expensive notebooks that are blank now, but not for any writer's block reasons, just for, as you say. I think that's such a useful thought, though, because I think part of the transition from, and I use amateur and professional here, not as qualitative terms, just as whether or not you earn your crust from this stuff, and therefore are working to brief and in order to earn money. Part of the transition from amateur to professional writer is about, number one, knowing yourself as a practitioner, so that you know how you work best, in order that you can, you know, maybe in a more indie environment, design processes around how you work best. But number two, developing a toolkit so that you can write on demand, because you can no longer sit around waiting for inspiration. You need to find out how to quickly write to deadline and brief. And that is a different set of tools that an amateur writer doesn't necessarily need. And again, this is not a quality judgment. It's just one of those material contexts for which you need to be adaptable. And Chella, it sounds like you're precisely working in a similar way, like adapting to the structures of the environment.
Yeah, I suppose that's the journalist. I used to be a games journalist, for those that don't know that. So that comes in handy, being able to write to deadline, having done that the rest of my career, my other career. But one of the other things that's really great about the big studio experience is you have a team of writers. So you essentially have a writing group. So basically going to work for me is like going to a writing group. It's great where you get, whereas the indie experience, if you're the only writer on the team, it can be lonely. It can be sort of hard to get that feedback and get those notes on your writing to really polish it. And I really like that aspect, that collaborative sort of like lots of notes and feedback and like sort of editing and stuff like that, which I didn't have on Before I Forget because I was the only writer.
Absolutely. One of the big pieces of advice I was given as a playwright was write the first draft, put it in a drawer for 6 months, and then come back to it and write the second. But in a professional context in video games, one of the tools you can use to shortcut that process is give it to someone else, because they are essentially a fresh set of eyes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So peers can be as useful a tool as, you know, other tools that you might pick up, which are just for you and a piece of paper. That's a really useful reflection. Thank you so much, Chella. Jake, I'm going to ask you now, because I am a supporter on your Patreon. And I recently got a really exciting email from you that I wish I had the time to attend. You're going to be doing a workshop on something which you called the poetics of game tools. Is that right? Or have I misphrased that?
Yeah. Can you hear me? It looks like my video is kind of okay. Good. So I'm still coming through. Okay, cool. Yeah. I've been kind of like on my team, you know, which is three of us, and my partner Tomas and I split kind of programming duties. So I'm like, and I like to build things myself, you know, just as a form of inquiry and research, and you know, so I like to build like the sort of dialogue systems from scratch rather than working with like ink or twine or you know, something else like that. Although I really love those tools, and I've been like kind of experimenting with them for years and studying them, and especially Inform too is another really cool one. But so you know, for me, as like, since my creative practice before I was working on games, I was just making like software art. So my creative practice has always been really centered on programming. And in fact, it was not really until I got into games that I started writing at the volume that I write now. So you know, I learned a lot from working on Kentucky Route Zero, and yeah. Anyway, I guess like the upshot of that is that I've become like just, you know, really curious about the craft of both writing code and writing you know, writing scripts or writing stories or something like that. And I've found, I think, I don't know, some kind of interesting new ways of looking at writing. I think I've learned some new models for thinking about writing from programming. So like, especially from math, even like going back to some of, like, I've been researching recently programming language design in the 20th century, like some of the earliest programming languages that came out of the 50s and 60s, and just sort of how they thought at that time about what they were doing. And you know, there's this kind of interesting, to me, historical division between programmers who are writing either instruction sets for machines, or programmers who are coming up with notation systems to describe things, you know? So those are two very different things, right? Instruction sets and notation systems. And I think, you know, most of the programming that we do is based on the model of an instruction set for an invisible machine that doesn't really exist, you know, in any fixed kind of way. And that kind of bleeds into the writing sometimes when we're doing writing in, like, if we're not following a process like the one Chella was describing, where, you know, where you're writing, drafting, and then sort of like entering data into the tool. If you're just kind of writing in the tool, which as you all have talked about, happens a lot in video games because you're so down to the wire. So anyway, that when you're writing in the tool, the sort of mechanics of the tool become, the texture of the tool becomes really important, because you're sort of putting yourself into this feedback loop with the tool where you write and then you need to read. And so the layout of it becomes very important, because it sort of shapes the way that you read stuff back to yourself. So when you are made to, when you're constrained by the language that you have, like say you have a sort of a scripting language for writing, and it could be something very simple, like the one that I devised for Kentucky Route Zero was just like, you know, these little scenes and people talk, and then one of the options that you get kind of links you to a different node. It's like a sort of go-to instruction. And it's just kind of like the way that it looks when you're working on a twine game. You're just kind of moving around through this graph. I guess, like, yeah, reading and writing that stuff back and forth, it's sort of as if you were forced to always write only in a particular metaphor. Like if you were to describe, you're trying to tell a story about somebody's life, but you could only tell the story in terms of like, you know, say they're a teacher, and like how they write things on the blackboard with chalk, and like, this is all you have is this one metaphor for describing things. So it can really kind of constrain the way that you write. And I think the poetics of these tools, of these game tools, comes in the play, the kind of interplay between what it's like to write and what the writing means, you know. And so sometimes there's more or less of a gap between those things. A gap is good, because that's where the play comes in, right? That's where you can be a poet. Like the gaps in the sort of like mechanism of meaning of language, natural language, are why we can do things like tell jokes and puns and poems and stuff like that, right? They're because of these sort of, you know, like in a mechanical system, you have like gears meshing, and if the gears are slightly different sizes and there's gaps in there, that's called play in the mechanical system, right? So that's the kind of like play that I'm talking about here. And so, yeah, I think that's really closely tied to what we would call poetics in any other kind of writing system that we use. So I'm kind of right now really curious, like, what if we kind of start looking away from programs and programming and scripting and look more towards notation as a model for our writing. And so I've been looking a lot at like experimental music from the 20th century, for example. They used a lot of interesting scores and notations, some of which I think is really relevant for games because a lot of 20th century music leaves extra room for the performers. Like the work of like the composer Morton Feldman, for example, he would write down the pitches, but not the durations. Play these for as long as you want, things like that. So there's some kind of interesting precedents in other art forms, art worlds.
Dance notation blew my mind when I learned about that, especially.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. Yeah, and there's so many different kinds of dance notations too and they have this really interesting problem of mapping a linear composition, a piece of music, into a spatial composition because dance happens in three-dimensional space. So that's a really interesting one to look at for games. Sure, yeah.
So I'm just going to wrap us up on this topic by saying, number one, follow the Cardboard Computer Patreon so that you can get these set of lectures and workshops from Jake, some of which are going to be recorded on your YouTube, so you don't even have to be like proximate in time zone or anything like that. So Cardboard Computer on Patreon. And then finally, just to say that I think that's such a good way of getting to the point that the material you're working with is also the tool you're working into. Like when I work in ink, I think differently to when I think in twine. I think differently to when I work in yarn. And each of these things are going to be shaping the kind of choices I think through or the way that I think about the story and its structure. And I will work better in some, but perhaps it's useful for me to work against the grain of what I feel comfortable in. Maybe it's useful for me to just always bear in mind that this tool is going to shape me towards certain kinds of choice or storytelling, and I just want to check back with myself and go, is that what the story needs though? So yeah, I think that's a really lovely way to wrap up the material conditions question. And I'm going to move us on now to a new subject, writing for characters. So what is it like to build a character in the medium of games? You build it around choice, but also, some more traditional craft of writing areas like the voice of a character, the idioms they use, the kind of voices that you use at different levels of the game. So like, is this a narrator? Do all the characters have the same voice because it's kind of a jokey game that's making jokes to you? Or do they need to be character driven for the demands of the story that you're telling? So I am going to throw to Jake first here, because I very, very often use Kentucky Route Zero as a means of talking about choice in shaping character. And just before I throw to Jake, I want to say, for the sake of saying out loud, that choice that doesn't result in a different ending isn't the only kind of choice that's valuable. And choice is a texture you can use in writing to develop characters, to take you down just to two different little notes on a character before bringing you back to the same thread. How you use choice is a quality and not a virtue of writing for games. And I think that's something we get lost in. Like, this is meaningless choice. And like, did you develop a character through that choice? Like, did the change happen in your head and not in the game mechanics? That might still be okay. Which is why I want to bring up Kentucky Route Zero. How did you settle on the way that choice works for the central characters? You start off with Conway, obviously. Mild spoilers, you sometimes play as other characters, but I don't know, I wonder if you could talk around that.
Yeah, well, there's like, the choices were sort of the main tool in my vocabulary kind of toolkit when I was writing that, and it was all about this like multiple response kind of choice, like a traditional point and click adventure game or something was kind of the jumping off point. And I think it was Tomas's idea, who's the artist who works on these games too, his idea to kind of switch perspectives. And we were also thinking about like a lot of literature that does that, switch, and a lot of film too, switches perspectives. But I was like, I'm a big William Faulkner, one of my favorite writers, and a lot of his sort of modernist works were hopping between perspectives every other page or something like that. So I was thinking about that work. And then we were just like, there's so many choices. Like I think there's like 5,000 options in KRC. I tried to figure it out. So and there's like about between 1,000 and 2,000 variables that the game tracks. These are like the flags that it tracks when you make choices. There's just a ton of them, and we were just trying to find a variety of different ways to use choices. And so it was kind of driven a lot by sort of experimental novelty or something. But one of the we did definitely find that we were using choices. There's one thing about like changing a plot event, but another thing it would be like letting the player sort of add some inflection to the characterization that sort of shapes the context for the plot event, which itself is perhaps inevitable, but like whether or not the character is excited about it or disappointed about it or not paying attention or something like that, you can just sort of like adjust the context a little bit. And then we, I think just looking for interesting formal conceits, like in some cases, like the characters filling out a quiz or doing filling out paperwork or something like that. These can be kind of interesting moments for different types of kind of reflective choices or choices that are just about pacing. I don't know. Yeah, we're just kind of looking for a variety and definitely, thinking about the characterization, like I guess that sort of showed up in. Oh, I'm trying to think of a good example. Oh yeah, okay. So there's like one character, Shannon, who's she talks on the phone sometimes, but we never hear the other side of the conversation. So that was a sort of one kind of like formal. We repeated that form several times throughout the game, and it was just a way to use, because the player is asked to make these choices with they don't see the other side of the conversation at all. So in that moment, the player knows that we're not expecting you to deliver the correct answer to this. There's obviously no correct answer, so it's just to try to prod them to approach the choices a little more reflectively.
One of the thrills, I think, of writing for games is how much happens in the player's head and how much you can trust your player to, like, we don't need the system to remember every single choice you make because you're creating a character in your head as a player. Like that phone conversation is a really good example. The player is imagining what might have been said when they decide what choice that they want to use.
Exactly,
and it's just a really nice way of asking the player to lean in and be part of the texture of the storytelling with the writing, to be a co-writer in a way. Which doesn't have to be about changing this character fundamentally, but having a think about how the world changing around you would shape a character, right? And I just really love that approach. I would like to, Chella, I think, as well as, before I forget, being a really interesting character study, because how do you study a character who might be because it's about someone with, did you say dementia or Alzheimer's? Dementia. And that is a certain like kind of dislocation from your own identity in a way, which is a really interesting thing to explore. But I imagine in moving to AAA, you've had to like quickly spin up on a bunch of like, pre-written lore, pre-written characters and learn very quickly to find character voices. So I wonder, in somewhere in between those spaces, you might like to talk about finding character voice.
Yeah, so sometimes a character's voice just pops into your head and it's there and it's immediate and it's quite strong and it's talking to you, so you kind of have to write this character because they've just popped into your head and they won't shut up kind of thing. But sometimes it's difficult, especially like you say, when you are assigned characters that maybe you didn't create from scratch. And then what I do is I just cast them. I use actors or like public figures. So for instance, someone like Daniel Radcliffe, for instance, who has this very kind of nervy, he speaks very quickly, and he's like sort of like all quite nervous energy and sort of self-deprecating kind of sense of humor, and it immediately gives you a sense of a character, because like even his physicality of how he speaks. And then someone like Maya Angelou has this really sonorous voice because she's a poet. So she has this really sort of lyrical sort of quality to her voice. And she's also quite commanding and but warm. The tone of her voice is very warm, and that again, and gives you a sense of a person. Like, why are these two people, like, how are they different, and how is their speech pattern, how does it manifest? And then it can lead to sort of like, why are they like that? Like, why is this person sort of more sort of seems more highly strung and sort of nervy, where this other person is kind of quite sort of centered in themselves and doesn't need to move very much, and will speak slowly and doesn't need to fill space. Will, like someone like Barack Obama, for instance, who's known as a great orator, will have this, who isn't afraid of the pause, doesn't need to fill that space, and that gives you a sense of they are sort of confident in what they're about to say and what their thoughts are, and they're also mindful about what they are going to say next and how they're going to say it. And so there's all those things that you can study in the way someone speaks and how they present, that then will reflect on character and really help you write that character. And it becomes really important for having a seamless sense of character throughout a game, because sometimes you might get thrown onto a quest that doesn't have characters that you're familiar with at all. For whatever reasons, you might suddenly be sort of thrown onto another bit of the game, and you have to quickly kind of get to know that character. And maybe another writer's written a lot of that character's arc already, so you have to be able to unpack how that character speaks. Like, what is it that that makes the characteristics of their voice? And I find it, I quite have a lot of fun sort of casting my characters, and I think I found that the most useful way to find a voice that just helps me write them. And once I've cast them, I can.
That's a really useful tool for sure. And in one of our current projects at Die Gute Fabrik, I'm working with a number of writers, and we keep voice sheets for each character, which contains like their often used, like what kind of imagery do they often use? What are their like go-to idioms? What age group are they? Is their language slightly more old-fashioned? How do they pause? How do they hesitate? If they're excited, do they freeze up? Or do they talk endlessly, right? So all of that stuff just recorded is another way of thinking through that same problem. And obviously all of these are different solutions to the same thing. And that what you say there about listening, one of the first things that I do with students or mentees who are sort of early on in their career is ask them to listen. There's a really beautiful thing in the UK run by the BBC and the British Library called the Listening Project. And it has for many years been getting two people to sit down together to just talk about something about their lives. And they're really beautiful kind of moments of like a father and a daughter talking about, losing their grandmother, or two friends talking about going through the experience of both having breast cancer, or someone talking about their experience of transitioning, like all these kinds of things, like big moments in people's lives, but also somehow two regular people off the street coming to talk about it. They have these booths which just sort of tour around the UK and the British Isles, and anyone can go into them. And what it does is capture different ages and different identities, different classes, and also different regional kind of idioms and idiosyncrasies. And just what I get people to do is I get them to pick one of these conversations, which are all free to access online. I get them to transcribe it and to get a real sense on the paper of how two different people speak, how they pause. I ask them to look at the imagery, and then I ask them to draw characters using those sort of words on the page. And it just becomes a really useful starting point for encouraging people to listen, because one of the crafts I think of building character is listening to how characters exist in your day-to-day life. Which also I think is a really good moment to hand over on this question to Matthew, because Eliza, I think, number one, has some of the best VO that I've ever experienced in a game. Honestly, I think that was incredibly done. remind me who was the VO director, because we should credit them as well.
Oh, her name is Chris Brown.
Chris Brown, and,
yeah, she works on a lot of the Double Fine stuff as well, and has been in the industry for quite a long time. It was a real pleasure working with her.
Yeah, she seems incredible, the stuff that she works on. But I also know that you must have done a lot of work to make sure that on the page, those characters sounded different. I wondered if you just wanted to give us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, I'll say two things about it. I think the first is that in order to find the voices for all of these characters, I took an old trick from just regular, fiction writing, which was I just tried to free write as each character. So I tried to get to at least 1,500 words of each character, just talking about their day, or kind of like having some sort of stream of consciousness, and get into their head and write as that. And then from there, I was able to pull a lot of like phrases and kind of thoughts and actually put them into their actual dialogue. The second thing that I think was important is that after doing all that and writing a bunch of the dialogue, there was also a kind of an additive process where you take that stuff and you talk to the artists about it, and they start to think about what this person looks like. And I found that like there were a lot of things where I had written a lot about the character, but then I never had actually described like what they were wearing, or like, what kind of expression their face has when they're not trying to make any expression. And the artists have to think about that. And so they were like, well, what should he be wearing? And I was like, oh, that's a very good question. What should he be wearing? And the same happened with the actors. It was also an additive process where I imagined it happening in a certain way. And these actors, I told them, first of all, be natural, and also feel free to, like, if that doesn't quite sound right to you, read it the way that like it seems the right way to you. And we pulled that performance back into the script. So I wasn't saying like, oh, you have to read this you have to do it exactly the way that it's written, which is pretty common for games because they have like specific timing requirements or whatever. So a lot of voice actors are like, oh, I have to say this exactly the way that it's written. But if you're willing to go back and forth a little bit, you'll find a lot of opportunity, I think, to really build something special out of the interplay between the different elements of a game.
And I think there's something really special about the joys of writing for collaboration. So whether that be for performance, whether that be for comics, whether that be for games, if someone else is going to be seeing your writing and bouncing off it, I think that there's a real joy to this practice, as well as all the difficulties. And I just wanted to flag, if anyone out there is interested in the practice of free writing, there's a book called The Artist's Way, which is a really good resource on sort of daily free writing practices. Not everyone gets along with everyone's methodology. The Artist's Way is actually not one that suited me ever, because I'm very structured. I like to make forms and briefs and things. But if you want to sort of experience free writing as a practice, see if it is for you, The Artist's Way is something that a lot of people get along with super well. I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask everyone to give a short answer on the next two questions. The last one was meant to be very quick anyway, so hopefully that's okay. I would like everyone to tell me who or what inspires you. And I'm going to kick off with Jake, unfortunately. Sure. That's because it's a big, difficult, annoying question, because we haven't kicked off with you. So, like, what writing, what practice, what games, what other media, what out there is inspiring you right now?
For me right now, I'm reading, it's kind of old, but I'm reading some of Bertolt Brecht's operas and the way that he wrote about the operas that he worked on. And I find a lot of connections with games, I think, because the way he describes it is there's this huge apparatus. You can't like make an opera without the opera apparatus, the whole thing. I think there's something like that with games too. So it's kind of interesting to think about, how to work yourself into this apparatus as an artist, and how to relate to it.
There is a whole section in my book on Threepenny Opera, which I'm really stoked that you brought up Brecht. But yes, there is. Brecht is also a really interesting thinker in terms of interaction and immersion, and how actually immersion can be contra-political, in that it's about washing you away and not putting you in the context where you can make engaged decisions and stuff. Probably a bit too much to bring into the last 5 minutes, but
That's great. You
Yeah,
shared that
Brecht's
out there.
operas. That's super cool. Matthew, what is inspiring you right now?
I think I'm really inspired by a lot of the work that's coming out in games these days. I would just want to say, like, since this year, a lot of games in really wonderful indie narrative games have come out, including Norco, Citizen Sleeper, Cephany, a bunch of others. And so I'm inspired by the fact that, like, so many people are creating so many cool things in this industry today, and that includes people who are working in AAA as well. Like, there are a lot of constraints and parameters, and there are really brilliant people doing work that you haven't heard of on big teams. So
yeah, some incredible character-driven dialogue comes out of AAA, and just because the narrative design might not be lifting the writing up doesn't mean that the dialogue isn't incredibly well written. Yeah, for sure. Chella, what is inspiring you at the moment?
I'm reading a lot of Caribbean fiction at the moment. I've got a couple of anthologies that are sort of Afrofuturist and speculative fiction coming out of the Caribbean. And at the moment, I'm reading Marlon James, which way around is it? Black Wolf, Red Leopard, which is his... Well, when he started, set out to write it. Game of Thrones was sort of ruling everything, and he's like, I'm going to write an African Game of Thrones. So that's what he's done. It's like steeped in African mythology, and it's kind of visceral and epic and beautifully written because it's written by him. And I'm reading that with a friend because it's so sort of intimidating. I was like, let's read this together. And so we've kind of like meet up. It's a friend in the UK because I live in Sweden, and we meet up over Google Hangouts or whatever it is we're using, WhatsApp, and have a book club kind of chat through this book.
Nice.
And it's cool. Yeah.
And I'm going to wrap up by saying that I'm inspired by all of you. Otherwise, why would have I brought you together? So we're just going to get into the end bit, which is just things to promote. And if you have any advice for people who might be in the sort of watching, who are interested in writing for games, what would your like one-liner piece of advice be? My advice would be, please buy my book. I printed this out. I printed this out for you all to see. This is what the book looks like. And I have a discount code, which I printed out backwards, so it hopefully is the right way around to everyone looking at now. If you go to routledge.com and you use this discount code, you get 20% off Writing for Games by Hannah Nicklin. It's a big yellow book. It's yellow. It's exciting. Hopefully stands out on your bookcase. And my advice is that you should buy it, please. All right, Jake, what are you promoting? Oh, and Mutazione is like 50% off in the LudoNarraCon sale. So go check out the last thing that I wrote as well. Jake, what are you promoting and what's your advice?
I don't have anything to promote except Kentucky Route Zero is on the Steam, but
people should
my advice
follow your Patreon.
Oh yeah. Follow our Patreon. You can do this workshop with me. That would be a lot of fun. I'd love to have you. And read Hannah's book. I talked to Hannah a lot about writing for games, and I've learned a lot. And I think if you read her book, I think it would be a good use of your time. And then I want to steal one liner from.
I learn from you as well. I learned from you as well. Okay.
Yeah, that's all.
Sorry.
I'll stop there. Get past on that, or Chella.
Chella, what are you promoting and what are you advising?
Well, it'd be great if you wishlisted Windrush Tales on Steam, which is about immigration from the Caribbean to the UK in the 1950s through 1970s, very specific part of British history. And of course, you can still buy Before I Forget on Steam too. That's what I've got at the moment.
Any advice for budding writers?
Advice. I think maybe look at theatre writing. I think, the go-to is film and TV as inspiration for writing for games, but I think you might be surprised how closely theatre and writing for an audience that interacts with your work in a 3D space. So think about theatre writing when you think about writing for games.
The best book on theatre writing, which is the most accessible, in my opinion, is Stephen Jeffries' Playwriting. It's just called Playwriting. Stephen Jeffries, because otherwise you'll get a billion books about it's not good SEO. Stephen Jeffries is not good at SEO. But yeah, that's an incredible book on the craft of playwriting, and I think that's a great shout, Chella.
You're amazing. How do you do that? Just pull relevant
I wrote a book on it.
titles.
It's in my head. Finally, Matthew, what have you? Sorry for calling you Michael earlier.
That's okay.
So what are you promoting, and what's your advice for
Yes.
writing?
So Eliza is also in the LudoNarraCon sale. Please check it out if you haven't yet. And I guess my piece of advice would be to say that a lot of games writing and writing in general takes place under non-ideal conditions. So please stick with it and persevere. That's what I would tell someone.
Yeah, and super finally, there is a big bit in my book about how you deal with the fact that the conditions are unideal, and also join a union, because there will be points in your career where you will need to advocate against systems and material conditions which are not okay, and unions will help you advocate for yourself and others, and that's really important. So I guess last piece of advice for budding writers: join a union, buy my book, look at playwriting, and I can't remember what was yours, Jake? Was it?
No, it's by your book. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. All right, I'm going to hold it up one more time because I did print it out backwards for everyone. Okay, so that's what it looks like. All right, I'm going to say that is the end, and yeah. Okay, everyone, I guess wave.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to us.